It will no longer be possible for me to give so much of my time and energies to the charities and issues for which I care so deeply.
September 8th, 2022. The announcement that shook the world. Queen Elizabeth II was gone, but what happened next will shock you. In mere seconds, everything changed. A son waiting 70 years finally claimed his destiny. Hidden heirs suddenly emerged with shocking new titles.
Charles has finally blocked Prince Harry's return to work in royal life.
Royal children's names erased overnight. And the one title everyone expected? It never came. The palace's carefully guarded secrets were about to explode into the open. Some royals gained unimaginable power. Others were left with nothing. What the royal family doesn't want you to know about that day will leave you speechless. The most substantial change, naturally, concerns the new monarch himself. Prince Charles, who had been heir to the throne for 70 years, became King Charles III upon his mother's death. This might seem straightforward, but there's actually an interesting wrinkle in how monarchs choose their official names. When someone becomes king or queen in Britain, they have the option to select what's called a regnal name, which doesn't necessarily have to be their given first name. Charles could have chosen to reign under a completely different name if he had wanted to. In the days leading up to the Queen's death, there was genuine speculation in the media and among royal watchers about what name Charles would select. One possibility that received considerable attention was George VII. This speculation wasn't unfounded. Looking at British history since 1714, there's been a clear pattern of kings choosing to reign as George. The Queen's own father provides a perfect example of this tradition. He was actually christened Albert Frederick Arthur George, and everyone in the family called him Bertie. However, when he unexpectedly became king after his brother Edward VIII abdicated, he chose to reign as George VI. This decision was particularly notable because he actually had a younger brother who was named George, yet he still selected that regnal name for himself. The reasoning behind this preference for George had to do with stability and continuity. The name carried weight and tradition, and in times of transition, the monarchy often leaned toward what feels familiar and reassuring to the public. However, when the moment came, Charles decided to keep his own name, becoming Charles III. This decision was revealed by the Prime Minister in a speech delivered on the very day that Queen Elizabeth died, ending the speculation quickly and definitively. Alongside the new king, another significant title change occurred with Camilla, who became Queen Consort. This designation had actually been the subject of considerable discussion and even controversy for many years. When Charles and Camilla married in 2005, there was enough public sensitivity about the situation that it was announced she would use the title Princess Consort when Charles eventually became king. This would have been an unusual arrangement, breaking with centuries of tradition, but it seemed like a compromise that acknowledged the complicated feelings many people still had about Charles's first marriage to Diana. However, during Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee celebrations in 2022, just months before her death, the Queen herself made an announcement that surprised many observers. She stated clearly that it was her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort when the time came. This public endorsement from Elizabeth essentially settled the matter. And indeed, when Charles became king, Camilla immediately took on the title of Queen Consort. It's crucial to understand that there's a fundamental difference between the type of queen that Elizabeth was and the type that Camilla is. These aren't just subtle distinctions in terminology, but represent completely different positions within the monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II was what's known as a queen regnant. This means she was the actual reigning monarch in her own right. The crown passed to her, not to her husband Philip. She held the sovereign power, and Philip's role was to support her, not the other way around. Camilla, by contrast, is a queen consort. This term specifically indicates that she is the wife of the reigning monarch. She holds her position because of her marriage to the king, not through any independent claim to the throne. In practical terms, this means she has no constitutional powers of her own. Her role is ceremonial and supportive, participating in royal duties and representing the monarchy at various events. But she doesn't have the authority that comes with being the actual sovereign. This distinction becomes clearer when we look at historical precedent. The last time Britain had a queen consort was actually in 1952, the year that Queen Elizabeth II ascended to the throne. At that point, Elizabeth's mother, who was also named Elizabeth, held the role of queen consort as the wife of King George VI. After her husband's death, she became known as Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother to distinguish her from her daughter, who was now Queen Elizabeth II. Here's an interesting detail that sometimes confuses people. Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother was never called Elizabeth I, even though she was named Elizabeth and was a queen. The reason is simple. Queen consorts don't receive regnal numbers. Those numbers are reserved exclusively for monarchs who reign in their own right. When we talk about Elizabeth III, we're referring to the famous Tudor queen who ruled during Shakespeare's time, from 1558 to 1603. She was a queen regnant, never married, and reigned alone, which is why she gets a number and is remembered as one of England's most significant monarchs. The system of consort titles applies regardless of gender, though in practice we've seen it work one way far more often than the other. When a queen regnant is married, her husband doesn't automatically become king. Philip, for instance, was Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, not King Philip. This is because in the British system, king is considered a higher rank than queen. So if Elizabeth's husband had been called king, it would have implied he outranked her, which would have contradicted the reality that she was the monarch. The male equivalent of queen consort is prince consort, though this title has to be specifically granted and isn't automatic. These changes to the titles of Charles and Camilla represent the foundation of the new royal structure. Everything else that followed, from William's new responsibilities to the ripple effects down through the line of succession, stems from this central shift. The monarchy is an institution built on precedent and tradition, but it's also one that must adapt to modern sensibilities while maintaining its historical character. The way these title changes were handled reflects that ongoing balance between honoring the past and acknowledging the present. When Queen Elizabeth II died, the changes to the monarchy weren't limited to just Charles and Camilla. The succession created a cascade of title changes that affected the next generation of royals, particularly Prince William and his family. These changes happened through a combination of automatic transfers and deliberate decisions by the new king, and they fundamentally altered William's role within the royal family. The moment the Queen passed away, William automatically inherited two significant titles without any ceremony or formal announcement needed. He became the Duke of Cornwall in England and the Duke of Rothesay in Scotland. These aren't just honorary titles that can be given to anyone. They're specifically reserved for the heir apparent to the throne, and they come with substantial responsibilities and assets. The Duchy of Cornwall, in particular, is a massive estate that generates considerable income, which now belongs to William as the person first in line to succeed his father. What makes William's situation particularly interesting is that he already held the title of Duke of Cambridge, which was given to him by the Queen when he married Catherine in 2011. This means he's now a duke 3 times over, though the titles apply differently depending on where he is. In England, he's known as the Duke of Cornwall in Cambridge. Cornwall comes first in this pairing because it's considered the higher-ranking title, given its connection to the heir apparent. His wife Catherine is correspondingly the Duchess of Cornwall and Cambridge. The Rothesay titles are only used when they're in Scotland, reflecting the separate Scottish peerage system that has existed since before the union of England and Scotland. However, the most significant change to William's status came the day after the Queen's death, when King Charles made a deliberate choice to grant him an additional title, Prince of Wales. This is a crucial distinction from the automatic titles. William didn't become Prince of Wales simply by being next in line. His father had to actively bestow the title upon him, and Charles did so in his first address to the nation as king. The title of Prince of Wales carries enormous historical and symbolic weight. Since the year 1301, it has been the tradition to grant this title to the heir apparent of the English throne, and later the British throne. It's become so closely associated with the position of heir that many people assume it transfers automatically, but it doesn't. The monarch must choose to confer it, though in practice, this has almost always happened. The history behind this title is actually quite complex and touches on the relationship between England and Wales. Before 1301, the title Prince of Wales referred to actual Welsh rulers who governed independently. Wales was its own entity, and from 1216 to 1283, there was a Principality of Wales that functioned as an independent monarchy with its own sovereign princes. These weren't symbolic rulers or ceremonial figures. They were actual monarchs who controlled Welsh territory and had real political and military power. Everything changed in 1283, when Wales was conquered and absorbed into the Kingdom of England. After this point, Wales ceased to be an independent principality, and the title of Prince of Wales lost its original meaning. Instead of indicating who actually ruled Wales, it became a title that the English monarch could grant to the heir to the English throne. The first English Prince of Wales was Edward of Caernarfon, who was given the title by his father Edward I in 1301. He later became King Edward II. Since then, the title has been used as a ceremonial designation, rather than one that indicates genuine authority over Wales. The Prince of Wales doesn't govern Wales in any meaningful sense. Wales has its own government structure, and the prince's role is more about representing the monarchy and undertaking royal duties in Wales and elsewhere. It's worth noting that not every heir to the throne has actually received this title. Sometimes there simply wasn't an heir apparent at the right time, or the heir died before they could be formally created Prince of Wales. But in the modern era, it's become the expected title for the person who will one day be king or queen. With William becoming Prince of Wales, Catherine automatically became the Princess of Wales. However, it's important to understand that Princess of Wales is what's called a courtesy title. Catherine isn't Princess Catherine in her own right. She's the Princess of Wales because she's married to the Prince of Wales. This is similar to how Camilla was technically the Princess of Wales when she married Charles, though she chose not to use that title for reasons we'll explore in a moment. The last person to actively use the title Princess of Wales was, of course, Diana, William's mother. Diana became one of the most famous women in the world, partly because of the visibility that came with being Princess of Wales. She used the title from her marriage to Charles in 1981 until their divorce in 1996. Even after the divorce, she retained the title Diana, Princess of Wales, though she was no longer Her Royal Highness. Her death in 1997, while she still held this modified version of the title, meant that the Princess of Wales became forever associated with her in the public imagination. This association created a delicate situation when Charles married Camilla in 2005. Technically, as the wife of the Prince of Wales, Camilla had every right to be called the Princess of Wales. It was her legal title. However, given the public's strong connection between Diana and that title, and the complicated history of Charles and Camilla's relationship, the decision was made that Camilla would not use it. Instead, she went by the Duchess of Cornwall, using Charles's other major title. This was seen as a respectful gesture toward Diana's memory and an acknowledgement of public sentiment. Now that Charles is king and Camilla is queen consort, Catherine has stepped into the role of Princess of Wales without the same complicated baggage. While comparisons to Diana are inevitable and frequently made by the media, Catherine has been able to establish her own identity in the role. She's been a working member of the royal family for over a decade, and by the time she became Princess of Wales, she had already built a solid reputation through her charitable work and public appearances. The changes to William and Catherine's titles have also affected their 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis. Previously, the children used the territorial designation of Cambridge after their first names. This is a common practice in the British royal family, where children of dukes use their father's duchy as a kind of surname. So they were George of Cambridge, Charlotte of Cambridge, and Louis of Cambridge. Now that their father is Prince of Wales, they use of Wales instead. They're now George of Wales, Charlotte of Wales, and Louis of Wales. Beyond the name change, their positions in the line of succession have shifted upward. Prince George, in particular, has moved from third in line to second in line to the throne. This puts him in an even more significant position within the royal hierarchy. He's now just one step away from eventually becoming king, barring any unexpected circumstances. Charlotte is now third in line, and Louis is fourth. This shift in the children's succession positions is significant because it affects how they're likely to be raised and what expectations will be placed on them. George, as second in line, will inevitably be prepared for kingship in a way that might be less intense for his siblings. The difference between being third in line and second in line might seem small, but it represents a fundamental change in his future role and responsibilities. The succession order also reflects how the British system of inheritance has evolved. Charlotte's position ahead of her younger brother Louis is a relatively recent development in royal history. Until 2013, the succession followed male preference primogeniture, which meant that younger sons would jump ahead of older daughters. However, the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013 changed this to absolute primogeniture, meaning that the order of birth matters regardless of gender. Charlotte benefits from this change, maintaining her place in line even though she has a younger brother. With all the attention focused on William's elevation to Prince of Wales and his children's new positions in the line of succession, some people have naturally wondered about Prince Harry's place in the royal hierarchy. A common question that emerged after the Queen's death was why Harry didn't become second in line to the throne. After all, he's the son of the king, just as William is. However, the answer to this question reveals something fundamental about how royal succession actually works in Britain and across most European monarchies. The British system of succession follows a principle called primogeniture, which essentially means that titles and positions pass down through generations rather than across them. In practical terms, this means that the children of the heir apparent take precedence over the siblings of the heir apparent. So William's children come before Harry in the line of succession, even though Harry is a generation older than them. This might seem counterintuitive at first, but it's actually crucial for maintaining stability in the succession. To understand why this system exists, it helps to consider what would happen if it didn't. If succession passed across siblings before moving down to the next generation, then upon the Queen's death, the line of succession would have been completely different. Instead of William being first in line, followed by his son George, it would have been Andrew, the Queen's second son, followed by Edward, her youngest son, and only then would it pass to William. This would create a situation where elderly relatives could become king or queen for just a few years before dying, and passing it to another elderly relative, creating constant instability and frequent transitions of power. The primogeniture system prevents this by ensuring that once a line is established through the eldest child, it continues down through that child's descendants before jumping back to consider other siblings. This is why George, who is just a child, ranks higher in the succession than his great-uncle Harry, who is a grown man. It's also why Charlotte and Louis rank above Harry, despite being much younger. They're in the direct line descended from William, who is the heir apparent. Harry did experience one change in his succession position following his grandmother's death. He moved up from sixth in line to fifth in line. This upward movement happens simply because everyone below the monarch moves up one spot when a new monarch takes the throne. However, unlike his brother, Harry didn't receive any new titles when his father became king. Some people expected that Harry might be given the title Duke of York, operating under the assumption that second-born sons traditionally receive this particular dukedom. There is indeed a historical pattern of second sons being granted this title, and it's one of the most senior dukedoms in the British peerage. However, the key word here is traditionally, not automatically. The Duke of York title doesn't transfer to every second son as a matter of course. It can only be granted if the title is currently available, meaning no one else is using it. The problem for Harry is that the title is very much not available. It's currently held by Prince Andrew, King Charles's younger brother, who received it from the Queen when he married Sarah Ferguson in 1986. Andrew has held this title for decades, and despite the various controversies that have surrounded him in recent years, he still retains it. There's been some public discussion about whether Andrew should be stripped of his titles given the circumstances that led to him stepping back from royal duties, but as of now, he remains the Duke of York. This means that unless King Charles makes the unprecedented decision to remove the title from Andrew and transfer it to Harry, which seems highly unlikely given the current relationship between the Sussexes and the rest of the royal family. The Duke of York title simply isn't an option for Harry. He remains the Duke of Sussex, the title he received from the Queen when he married Meghan Markle in 2018, and there have been no indications that any additional titles are forthcoming. However, while Harry and Meghan didn't receive new titles themselves, there was one significant change that affected their family. Their two children, Archie and Lilibet, automatically became prince and princess upon their grandfather's accession to the throne. This change happened because of the specific rules that govern who is entitled to be called a prince or princess in the British royal family. These rules were established by King George V in 1917 through what are called letters patent, which are formal legal documents issued by the monarch. According to these rules, 3 categories of people are entitled to be prince or princess. First, the children of the monarch are automatically prince or princess. Second, the grandchildren of the monarch in the male line are prince or princess. And third, the children of the eldest son of the Prince of Wales are also entitled to these titles. When Archie was born in 2019, he didn't fit any of these categories. He was the great-grandchild of the monarch, which didn't qualify him for the title. His father Harry was indeed a prince, but Harry wasn't the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. He was the younger son. This meant that Archie and later Lilibet were born without prince or princess titles, instead being styled as Master Archie Mountbatten-Windsor and Miss Lilibet Mountbatten-Windsor. This situation changed the moment Queen Elizabeth died. At that point, Charles became king, which meant that Harry's children were now the grandchildren of the monarch in the male line. They met the second category of the George V rules, which meant they were automatically entitled to be called Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet. This wasn't something that required the king to grant or approve. It happened automatically based on the existing rules. William and Catherine's children provide a useful point of comparison. When Prince George was born in 2013, he was technically only the great-grandchild of the monarch, which wouldn't normally have qualified him for prince status. However, the Queen issued a new letters patent specifically to ensure that all of William's children would be prince or princess from birth. She did this because William was the direct heir to the heir, and his children would be in the direct line of succession. The Queen wanted to make sure they had appropriate titles from the start. For Harry and Meghan's children, the situation was less clear-cut. The question wasn't whether they were entitled to the titles. Once their grandfather became king, they definitely were. The question was whether Harry and Meghan would actually choose to have their children use these titles. This might seem like an odd question. Why wouldn't parents want their children to be prince and princess? But there's actually precedent for parents declining to use titles that their children are technically entitled to. Prince Edward, the youngest of Queen Elizabeth's children, provides the clearest example of this. His 2 children, Louise and James, were both born as grandchildren of the monarch in the male line, which meant they were automatically entitled to be princess and prince. However, Edward and his wife Sophie made the decision not to use those titles for their children. Instead, Louise is known as Lady Louise Windsor, and James uses his father's subsidiary title and is known as the Earl of Wessex, though he recently inherited the title Viscount Severn when his father became Duke of Edinburgh. The understanding was that Edward and Sophie wanted their children to have more normal lives, without the intense scrutiny and expectations that come with being styled as prince and princess. Harry and Meghan faced a similar decision with Archie and Lilibet. Given that they've stepped back from working royal roles and have been vocal about wanting privacy and normalcy for their children, there was genuine speculation about whether they would embrace the prince and princess titles or decline them. For several months after the Queen's death, there was no official confirmation one way or another. The children were sometimes referred to with their new titles and sometimes without them, in various reports and statements. Eventually, in early 2023, it was confirmed that Harry and Meghan had decided their children would use the titles. The announcement came when Lilibet was christened and was referred to as Princess Lilibet in the official announcement. This indicated that the family had chosen to embrace the titles despite their complicated relationship with the institution of the monarchy. The decision to use the titles makes sense from several perspectives. Regardless of Harry and Meghan's personal feelings about the royal family, their children are legitimately entitled to these styles under long-standing rules. Declining them might have been seen as rejecting part of their children's heritage and identity. Additionally, there were concerns about security and how the children would be treated differently if they didn't have titles while their cousins did. The titles come with certain protocols and protections, even if the children aren't working members of the royal family. The changes to the titles of Charles, William, and Harry's families represent the most visible and widely discussed shifts in the royal hierarchy following Queen Elizabeth's death. However, these weren't the only changes that occurred, and there are several other members of the royal family whose positions and titles were affected or are likely to change in the near future. Understanding these additional changes helps paint a complete picture of how the monarchy has been restructured. First, it's worth noting that every single person in the line of succession moved up one position when the Queen died and Charles became king. This is a simple mathematical consequence of removing one person from the line and having everyone else shift upward. While this might seem like a minor detail, it does have practical implications for those further down the line. Moving from, say, 15th to 14th in line might not seem significant, but it does technically bring that person slightly closer to the throne and can affect how they're perceived in terms of their royal status. The question of who remains in the line of succession has generated some discussion, particularly regarding Prince Harry and Prince Andrew. Both of them have stepped back from being working members of the royal family, though for very different reasons and under very different circumstances. Harry and Meghan made a personal decision to step away from royal duties and pursue financial independence, relocating to the United States and building careers outside the traditional royal framework. Andrew, on the other hand, was effectively forced to step back from public duties, following the scandal surrounding his association with Jeffrey Epstein and the subsequent legal issues he faced. Despite these situations, both Harry and Andrew remain in the line of succession. Harry is currently 5th in line, and Andrew is 8th in line. Some people have questioned whether they should be removed, given that they're not working royals. But the reality is that being a working royal and being in the line of succession are two separate things. The line of succession is determined by bloodline and the rules of primogeniture, not by whether someone actively performs royal duties. There are actually very few ways to be removed from the line of succession. Death is the most obvious one. Becoming the monarch yourself also removes you from the line of succession, though obviously this is because you've reached the position rather than being excluded from it. Abdication is another possibility, where someone who has become monarch chooses to step down, which would remove them from ever returning to the line. Additionally, if someone marries a Catholic, they're removed from the line of succession, though this rule has been somewhat relaxed in recent years. Beyond these specific circumstances, there's no mechanism for simply removing someone from the succession because they've become controversial or have stopped performing royal duties. One title change that hasn't happened yet but is widely expected to occur in the near future involves Prince Edward, the youngest of Queen Elizabeth's 4 children. Edward currently holds the title Earl of Wessex, which he received from the Queen when he married Sophie Rhys-Jones in 1999. However, it has long been understood that Edward would eventually receive the title Duke of Edinburgh, a title that carries particular significance within the royal family. The Duke of Edinburgh title was most famously held by Prince Philip, Queen Elizabeth's husband, who received it from King George VI when he married the then Princess Elizabeth in 1947. Philip held this title for over 70 years until his death in 2021. The title meant a great deal to Philip, and he was deeply involved with the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, a youth development program that operates in numerous countries around the world and has impacted millions of young people. When Philip died, the Duke of Edinburgh title didn't become vacant. Instead, it automatically passed to Charles as the eldest son. This is how hereditary peerages work in the British system. When a duke dies, his eldest son inherits the dukedom. At the time, Charles was still the Prince of Wales, so he held both titles simultaneously. However, now that Charles has become king, the situation has changed fundamentally. A reigning monarch cannot hold other titles in the same way that other members of the aristocracy do. When someone becomes king or queen, all their subsidiary titles effectively merge with the crown. They don't cease to exist entirely, but they're no longer actively held as separate honors. This means that the Duke of Edinburgh title has essentially gone dormant. It's merged with the crown, and for practical purposes, it no longer exists as an active title that anyone holds. However, because the title has merged with the crown rather than simply becoming extinct, the king now has the power to recreate it and bestow it on someone else. It's widely expected that King Charles will grant the Duke of Edinburgh title to his brother Edward. This expectation isn't based on mere speculation. It was actually announced at the time of Edward's wedding in 1999 that he would eventually receive the Duke of Edinburgh title. The understanding was that this would happen after both Philip and the Queen had died. There appears to have been some delay in making this official. Various reports have suggested different reasons for this. Some have indicated that Charles wanted to take time to consider the structure of the royal family and how titles should be distributed in his reign. Others have suggested that there were discussions about whether the title should be hereditary, as it was for Philip, or whether it should be a life peerage that would end with Edward rather than passing to his son James. The question of heredity matters because it affects the long-term future of the title. If Edward receives the Duke of Edinburgh title as a hereditary peerage, then when he dies, it will pass to his son James, who currently holds the title Earl of Wessex, having inherited it from his father when Edward was created Duke of Edinburgh. From James, it would presumably pass to his son, if he has one. This would establish a new line of Dukes of Edinburgh separate from the main royal line. Alternatively, Charles could grant Edward the title as a life peerage, meaning it would only last for Edward's lifetime and would become extinct when he dies. This would allow Charles or future monarchs to decide what to do with the title at that point, perhaps granting it to another family member or letting it remain dormant. There are arguments for both approaches, and it's not yet clear which path the king will choose. Another member of the royal family whose title situation is worth understanding is Princess Anne, the king's only sister. Anne holds the title of Princess Royal, which is a special designation traditionally given to the eldest daughter of the monarch. However, unlike some titles, the Princess Royal designation can only be held by one person at a time, and it can only be granted if it's currently available. Princess Anne received this title from her mother in 1987. Interestingly, Queen Elizabeth herself was never Princess Royal, even though she was the eldest daughter of King George VI. The reason for this is that when her father was king, the title was held by his sister, Princess Mary. Mary had received the title from her father, King George V, and she held it until her death in 1965. By that point, Elizabeth had already been queen for 13 years, and you can't be both the reigning queen and the Princess Royal. So the title simply remained vacant until Elizabeth granted it to Anne. If Princess Anne were to die while her brother Charles is still king, the Princess Royal title would become vacant. At that point, it would remain vacant because Charles doesn't have any daughters. The title can only be held by the daughter of a monarch, and all of Charles's children are sons. However, if Anne lives long enough that William becomes king during her lifetime, and then Anne dies while William is on the throne, the title could potentially be granted to William's daughter, Princess Charlotte. Charlotte is William's eldest daughter, and would therefore be eligible for the Princess Royal designation. This scenario with Charlotte highlights how these titles can skip generations, and how their availability depends entirely on timing and the specific family structure at any given moment. Charlotte is currently third in line to the throne, and unless something unexpected happens, she'll likely spend most of her life as a senior working member of the royal family. The Princess Royal title would be fitting for her role, but whether she receives it depends on factors largely outside anyone's control. There's also been speculation about what might happen with the Duke of York title in the future. As mentioned earlier, this title is currently held by Prince Andrew, and it's not available to be granted to anyone else while he's alive. However, looking further ahead, there's a possibility that Prince Louis, William's younger son, might eventually receive this title. The Duke of York has historically been granted to second-born sons, and Louis is indeed a second son. However, this would only happen after Andrew's death, and only if William is king at that point. Additionally, it would require King William to choose to grant the title to Louis, rather than letting it remain dormant or granting it to someone else. The situation with Andrew has complicated the Duke of York title significantly. Given the controversy surrounding him, future monarchs might decide that the title carries too much negative association and choose not to use it for a generation or more. Alternatively, they might feel that enough time has passed and that granting it to Louis would represent a fresh start for the dukedom. These are decisions that won't be made for many years, and they'll depend on circumstances and public sentiment at the time. All of these potential future changes demonstrate that the royal title system is not static. It evolves with each generation, shaped by the specific family structure, the decisions of the reigning monarch, and the traditions that have developed over centuries. The changes that occurred after Queen Elizabeth's death represent just one moment in this ongoing evolution, and there will undoubtedly be further adjustments as time goes on, and as the next generation of royals comes of age and takes on more prominent roles within the family.